Support for Conversations Live comes from the members of WPSU and from
Dick's Honda, serving central Pennsylvania for 3 generations with quality Honda vehicles, service, and parts. On West College Avenue, State College, and at dickshonda.com.
The United States produces enough electricity through wind energy to power nearly 16 million homes annually. Still, wind energy faces many challenges, from the loss of tax breaks to risks of forest fragmentation and reports that industrial wind turbines kill wildlife and make some people sick. Tonight, our experts will talk about wind energy. They'll also take your questions. Our toll-free number is 1-800-543-8242, and our email address is connect@wpsu.org. If you'd like to join us on Twitter, you can tweet a question to @WPSU and use the hashtag WPSU Conversations. Now let's meet our guests. Susan Stewart is a research associate in the Aerospace Engineering and Architectural Engineering departments at Penn State. Her research focuses on renewable energy technology and implementation. Tamara Gagnolet is the Energy Program Manager at the Nature Conservancy's Pennsylvania office. She served on the research team that developed the Pennsylvania Energy Impacts Assessment, which we'll talk more about, and she's now analyzing energy impacts across the Central Appalachians. Thank you both so much for joining us. Let's start with something very simple. We hear the terms windmill and wind turbine used interchangeably. What's the difference, and what's the correct word that we should be using here?
So windmill is usually something that's used to to describe something that's performing actually a mechanical work. So usually grinding grain or pumping water. So wind turbine is when you're actually producing electricity. So that's something I usually cover on day 1 in my classes.
So let's get that out of the way.
Yeah.
Now, according to Power Magazine and everything I looked at, wind generation made up about 4% of America's electricity production in 2013. And the Obama administration and others would like to see that go to 20% by 2030. So we're currently wind is currently our 5th biggest source of energy. What are the projections for the future? How do we get from providing 4% of America's electricity to 20%?
Well, we're well on our way. I mean, we've been steadily adding capacity from year to year. We certainly, with our production tax credit, has helped spur that generation growth over the last several years, even though we've had some bumps in the road in that.
With the tax credit?
Yeah, with the tax credit. We're
on again, off again.
On again, off again. But the Energy Policy Act of 2005 enacted it for a long period of time, and that's what really took us into a steady period of growth. It expired at the end of 2012 for 1 day, was enacted again for new projects that started by the end of 2013. Then we actually have a current, at present, a record number of projects under development. Even though we didn't have that many that were added in 2013, we're going to see over the next 2 years still a continued growth. There's still uncertainty on where the tax credit will go from here on out, but it's not that the industry needs the tax credit. There are still plenty of locations in the United States that can have profitable projects, which means that it's windy enough for a project to be economically profitable.
Viable. Okay. Yeah. Well, let's talk about what's happening in Pennsylvania. We currently rank 15th or 16th, depending on whose number you're looking at, in installed wind power capacity. Tamara, what is Pennsylvania's wind power potential, and how many wind turbines do we have in the state right now?
We have considerable potential in Pennsylvania, and we have a little over 700 wind turbines installed right now, with more projected, of course.
And according to your assessment, the projection is that by 2030, we could have as many as 2,900. That's the high estimate.
Yes. I want to emphasize that that estimate was only for onshore wind and did not include Lake Erie. There's a lot more potential on the lake itself. So the Nature Conservancy certainly supports renewable energy sources, a mix of renewable energy sources, including wind, but of course recognizing that properly locating those wind facilities is very important for avoiding and reducing harm to the environment that does come from any form of energy development, including renewables.
Well, let's talk about siting, because you both know very well that there are lots of people who complain about a number of things associated with a wind turbine being their neighbor. So how important is siting? And aside from good, clean, unburdened wind, what do developers look for? Maybe I should ask that of you first.
Well, I would
Dr.
say
Stewart.
the first thing a developer probably would look for is the wind resource. Power in the wind is a function of the cube of the velocity, so wind speed is extremely important. That's the number one thing. I would say the number two thing is probably a tie-in to the grid, so close interconnection, because having to build a transmission infrastructure is expensive. So I would say those are probably the number one.
And disruptive as far as the environment is concerned.
So those are probably the number one and number two things. Then you start to consider all the other factors that will go into siting. So, the environment, which is huge. I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into that. There's populations of all sorts of species, the forest, because in the Pennsylvania area, this is really. I think pretty much every wind farm has been, for the most part, in forested areas. So it's considering.
And of course, this is something you look at: forest fragmentation,
watershed impacts, and I don't know.
Right, about 80% of the turbines existing and projected that we projected would be in a forested context, and that's just because that's where the wind resource is. They're along ridge lines. It's along the Allegheny front, where there are changes in elevation that cause there to be increased wind speeds. So the factors we looked at when projecting energy development were exactly what Dr. Stewart said was, of course, the wind resource itself, proximity to transmission lines to get the electricity to market, and then things like access to roads and things like that.
You actually looked at three things that are basically new technologies in Pennsylvania and that have enormous potential for expansion. So the first one was fracking, the second one was wind power, and the third was wood biomass. When you look at those three in terms of the kilowatt, the energy that they'll provide to Pennsylvania and the impact they'll have, tell us how they rank.
That's a very interesting question. It's actually not one that we addressed in our study explicitly. We didn't look at the impact per unit of energy produced, but we did. The point of the analysis was, when we did it back in 2010, was really to get an understanding of what these new forms of energy development could mean for Pennsylvania's forests and rivers and streams and sensitive species, and to look at those forms of energy development cumulatively, looking at them together, what's the total impact that could happen. And so we looked at the land footprint, the spatial footprint of development for Marcellus gas development, wind development, and also tried to get a sense for wood biomass. That was a little more challenging. But we actually projected the number of wells and well pads for Marcellus gas and the number of wind turbines
And in fact,
the future.
you're projecting 60,000 well pads by 2030 in Pennsylvania. Now, a well pad, how much acreage? Or you needed to correct me about something.
60,000 wells, not well pads.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks for clearing that up. But what is required in terms of land for a wind turbine versus a well? How much land is used?
The relative footprint of wind development is smaller on a per turbine or per pad basis. So we found that the land footprint per turbine was about 1.5 acres cleared in a forested context per pad, turbine pad, but a couple of acres in addition to that for associated infrastructure. So for the access roads to get to those pads, for the transmission lines to take the energy to market. We did the same assessment for gas, and the estimates are about twice as much. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to go to our first call. We have Daryl calling us from Martinsburg. Daryl, you're on the air. What's your question, please?
I volunteer on Jack's Mountain down in Mifflin County, where we've been successful to actually stop wind development. What I wanted to ask about, what are some of the environmental problems when wind projects are built on steep forested mountains? Our forested mountains are important sources of water to the farms and homes in the valleys below. My feeling is, and a lot of our people are feeling is, shouldn't wind turbines be banned from the top of steep, narrow mountains?
We'll have both of our guests. We'll begin with you, Dr. Stewart.
Well, I mean, I think there's lots of examples where wind projects have been very successfully installed on the tops of mountains where we have exceptional watersheds with absolutely no impact to the water. And I say that when the community is very active and maybe specific community members are there monitoring, involved with the project, making sure it's done well, and not only during construction, but also while the project is in operation. So and a lot of that is the road infrastructure, just like any road. Watching the runoff from the roads.
And Daryl was talking about ridge tops, and of course, ridge tops is where most of these turbines are going to go because that's where the wind is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So could you answer the question as well, please, Tamara? His question about whether they should be there because these are important natural habitats and resources.
Sure. Whenever considering expanding activities such as wind development into new areas and potentially sensitive areas, we need to consider a whole host of factors. So of course the potential for erosion and sedimentation into streams is one of them. So again, the big picture of just looking at siting overall. But if it's determined that a steep ridgetop is appropriate siting and not along a migratory route for birds and bats, for example, then there are operational practices and construction practices that can be used to reduce the impacts.
One of the things I feel like we need to consider when we talk about this is if our energy source is natural gas, for example, and from fracking, then we're also using a lot of water resource just to extract it. And when I think of wind, even though there is no form of energy production that doesn't have some unintended consequences, there is no water used in wind energy. Mm-hmm. And there are no carbon emissions.
Right, not in the actual production of the power, right. Certainly there's some emissions, in the creation of the product.
Yes. Right. And we're talking about wind turbines used to be 60 to 80 feet tall, and they are now 400 plus.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about, and then I'll take this call from Mark, but where are most of the turbines in Pennsylvania and really nationwide being made? Are they being made in the United States, and are they providing good jobs?
Oh, yes. I mean, really the production tax credit being on again and off again wreaks a little bit of havoc on our industry, maintaining the stable jobs, which that's the unfortunate part of this policy. But certainly there are a lot of U.S. jobs involved in this industry still today, and with the amount of turbines that are being produced into the future with the previous 2013, and they did just extend it through 2014, which probably didn't do a whole lot. But the statistics are, a lot of the towers and a lot of the blades are manufactured in the United States, and a lot of that is because of the sheer size of them, and it doesn't make sense to ship them overseas. There are some of the components that are in the nacelle we bring in largely from Europe.
You said the nacelle, and of course this is what houses all of these gears that make that wind turbine operate.
Yeah, but then a lot of nuts and bolts and some other the smaller components, a good portion of those are from the U.S. Some fraction of those do come from overseas, but I think on the order of 60% is U.S. made overall. The Department of Energy has been trying to encourage companies to slowly increase that over time and make it more and more U.S. made. And it just makes sense, and certainly in terms of the large components. The reason why some of the generator, for instance, still comes from Europe because they have very high quality steel, and then the gearboxes also. And we haven't quite been
higher than steel you can get in the U.S.
Yes, honestly, actually.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Okay, we'll take our phone call now from Mark. He's calling us from Bellefonte. Go ahead, please, Mark.
Yes. We live in a ridge and valley situation, from Carlisle up to here, and then we go into the Allegheny Plateau, and I guess that might be where the wind sweeps across our mountains. And I just wanted to see, what is your vision for, the Seven Mountains? Do you see turbines on top of that as an energy source?
On Seven Mountains in particular.
Tamara, your assessment, you actually kind of projected where in the state you think they will be sited. And of course, you don't have a crystal ball, but was Seven Mountains part of your projection?
I'm actually unfamiliar with that area,
Okay.
I'm afraid to say, but
It's just east of here, near on the way to Lewistown. I don't know if that helps, but
okay. Yeah, our projections, the locations or the highest probability areas for wind development tended to be in the Laurel Highlands in the southwest and in the north central and northeastern parts of the state in general.
I've heard whisperings of people investigating that area, I guess, but I don't know of anything specific. So
Okay.
it's hard to comment.
I could speak as a vision for the energy future. You know, my colleagues at the Nature Conservancy did a nationwide study a few years ago looking at using already disturbed lands for siting wind development, and there's a lot of potential
Disturbed by
there.
what? By coal mining or
yes,
or
disturbed
what?
by previous human activities. So
Which makes
abandoned
sense, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and abandoned coal mines are a perfect example. Brownfields, other areas that are already impacted and are not in a natural state right now. Those are perfect places to put wind turbines. Also looking at migratory routes for birds and bats, of course, but from a land footprint perspective, those are good places to put wind. And my colleagues projected that most of our renewable energy goals could, and the wind portion of that could be met by siting wind on already disturbed lands.
Are wind developers working closely with organizations like the Nature Conservancy when they decide where to site these enormous turbines?
They aren't working with us specifically, but here in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Game Commission, the agency responsible for birds and mammals in the state, they have a voluntary cooperative agreement with over 30 operators. And right now, that's a terrific effort that's been very successful and has a lot of potential to reduce impacts. So those operators that sign on to this agreement work with the Game Commission to do pre-construction and post-construction monitoring. And
they're telling them how many birds have died as a result of...
So we're learning a lot from that research. A lot more research is needed. So those kinds of pre- and post-construction surveys are very important for better understanding what can be done in terms of siting, and also operationally what can be done to reduce impacts to birds and bats.
Okay, we'll follow up with that in a moment. We have an email I'd like to go to. This one from John, he writes, how much does it cost to build a TMW turbine, and how much of that is subsidized?
2 megawatt.
2 megawatt. Thank you.
So 2 megawatt turbine today, an installed cost for a 2 megawatt or for per megawatt is about $1,600 per megawatt. So a 2 megawatt would be about $3,200.
So this is someone who would be interested for home use, a wind turbine on their property, something this small.
That would be that would be a very large turbine to put on your own property. So this is an industrial scale turbine. So that would be that'd be millions of. Sorry, I'm probably not saying that correctly. 32. That would be. I'm not saying the math correctly.
Round it.
$1,600. I mean, that's going to be $3.2 million for a 2 megawatt.
Okay, and is it subsidized? Is maybe part of the bigger part of the
saying
question?
What fraction of that is subsidized? That's a tricky question. So the subsidies come into play in the actual energy production. So that depends on where you put it and how efficient it operates in that regime. So if you put it in a place where you're not going to produce any power, then you're not going to get
any subsidy,
no,
any tax credit.
No, because the tax credit is a per energy output. So it's right now 2.3 cents per kilowatt hour. So again, yeah. So you are you benefit from putting it in a higher wind resource site, for sure.
And that tax credit is good for 10 years.
The first
and a
10
typical
years, yeah.
turbine might have a life of 20 years.
Right.
So the first 10 years you're getting this tax subsidy, and if
Right.
it's not renewed, or even if it is renewed, is it only good for 10 years?
It's 10 years, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then there are the other tax incentive, which is an incentive for all sorts of other industries, is accelerated depreciation also. So instead of depreciating the equipment over the lifetime of the equipment, 20 years, you can depreciate it over 5 years, which is actually comes back pretty quickly. That helps considerably on.
How do federal subsidies for wind energy compare with subsidies for fossil fuel industries, for example? Because this is something people talk a lot about, and I hear people say two completely different things.
Well, there's permanent subsidies for oil and gas.
Permanent, how so?
Permanent. Well, they're just written in. They don't debate them and on again, off again every year. They're written in. I don't know the details of that. That's not something I study and compare.
Right, you're an engineer.
No, I do study financial stuff on the renewable side, but I'm not, able to debate it compared to oil and gas. But I do know that these things are permanently written into the tax code for oil and gas.
Okay, and the on again, off again, this is for political reasons. Why, what I'm reading is that the tax subsidy really helped to get the wind industry on its feet, but in 2012, when they were pulled, that activity dropped to like 2004 levels, so it did have an impact.
Well, initially, and then when it was extended for a year, then all of a sudden we have a record number of projects under development. So that's only because you can't start a project and finish it in 1 year. And then they made it such that you didn't have to finish it within that year to qualify for the production tax credit. So, which was a good thing that they wrote it a little bit differently that time, so that you could just get it started by the end of 2013 to qualify for it that time. Now, I'm a big proponent for, let's pass it for a certain period of time, 3 years, something very defined, phase it out, and say goodbye. Having something finite and
instead of this on again, off again.
Yes, what we need is certainty. That's all we need is certainty. Or get rid of it and say that's it, but that's not going to work. Somebody's always going to try to push for it. But we need a phase out that is certain.
The Union for Concerned Scientists said basically what you're saying, that it's creating an unstable industry.
Yes, absolutely. And even the American Wind Energy Association has said we need to phase this out and move on. But then what happens is a tax package is created, and it's just so easy for one senator to say, well, let's throw it in there and jump on the bandwagon. And then all of a sudden it's extended for a year, and you get in the cycle again. And I don't know, that's politics for you.
Okay. Well, if you are just joining us, I'm Patty Satalia, and this is Conversations Live Wind Energy on WPSU TV, WPSU FM, and WQLN TV in Erie. Our guests tonight are Susan Stewart, Research Associate in the Aerospace Engineering and Architectural Engineering Departments at Penn State, and Tamara Gagnolet, the Energy Program Manager at the Nature Conservancy's Pennsylvania office. Our telephone number is 1-800-543-8242, and our panelists are ready to take your phone call. If you'd prefer to email us, our address is connect@wpsu.org. You can also join us on Twitter. Find us under the address @WPSU and use the hashtag WPSU Conversations. And we go now to Laura from Everett. Laura, you're on the air.
Thank you. I do have one comment about the subsidies. And that's the fact that the American Wind Energy Association spends millions of dollars lobbying Congress every year for the subsidies. And so in that respect, I think the wind industry really does depend on that financial gift. But my question tonight is for Susan. Susan, you mentioned that there are private groups that are monitoring water quality after wind projects have been developed, and I'd really like to know more about that. I've tried to look at the wind projects that have gone into my area on the Allegheny front, and I see gates across the roads. I see no trespassing signs, and it looks like the wind industry really doesn't want citizens to be involved in monitoring. And I've been told the DEP really doesn't do much monitoring after a wind project goes in. So I would really like to know what companies allow citizen monitoring on their projects.
Well, there should be an environmental outfit involved with each project. The companies that were engaged in probably doing early assessments are probably involved in follow-up, but I would imagine, I know that the landowners should be the ones, because really all the projects in Pennsylvania are on private land. So I would say that landowners should be the ones also out there monitoring and maybe educated into what to look for, and following up with, what should the graded roads look like, make sure that they're coming out to maintain them. And so there's a couple different levels of that I'm talking about. I don't know that there are actual private groups specifically, but so there could be companies that are actually engaged in the project, but also the landowners themselves.
Timur, what are you seeing from the Nature Conservancy? What are the impacts, the water impacts from a wind farm being installed on a ridgetop near you?
Mm-hmm. There are potential impacts to water quality, mostly during the construction phase. The potential for erosion, just converting forested land to cleared land, right, has the potential for erosion and putting sediment into streams. And trucks and road traffic accessing those turbine pads going across streams and things like that. But again, things can be done to properly site the road. Using existing roads is a great way to reduce impacts, and then making sure that the road surface and everything drains properly and really minimizes
And what
erosion.
agency is overseeing this? You're saying the DEP doesn't oversee these roads to wind turbine facilities?
My understanding is facilities that meet certain thresholds of land clearing do need certain permits. They need NPDES permits that require erosion and sedimentation control measures and things like that. So yes, there is oversight at the state level.
I think about the Somerset County, which had the very first wind farms in Pennsylvania, 8 turbines. Mm-hmm. What's the average size of a wind farm in Pennsylvania today? Much more than 8 turbines.
Yeah, that was the very first project. I don't know what the average size is, but it's certainly grown. There are projects with dozens and dozens of turbines. Perhaps Susan could speak to that.
I'd guess maybe more like 40 or so,
Okay.
but I don't know.
All right. Megan from State College, you're on the air, please.
Hi, I was wondering for Dr. Stewart, what do you expect the energy prices for natural gas and wind energy to be within the next few years?
Well, that really depends on location. For wind energy, the price is very specific to the wind resource, and because again, the power is a function of the cube of the velocity. So, and then whether a project is profitable is very much dependent on then what the local cost of electricity is, and that's dependent upon all sorts of other factors as well.
But it's gone down considerably in the last couple of years. I think 40%
yes.
in the last 3 years.
Yeah, so around here, certainly projects are probably in the 6 cent per kilowatt hour range, I would imagine. But natural gas costs, it's really, the fuel cost is what's fluctuating with the natural gas costs going up and down, and it's all about whether they're building new natural gas power plants or not. So those numbers shift constantly, essentially, and just go above and below each other right now. Right now they're just kind of flip-flopping around each other. I would say natural gas is probably generally a little bit cheaper than wind at the moment, but just a couple of years ago it was reversed. And the uncertainty for natural gas is certainly what makes wind look good, because we don't know what natural gas will do in the future.
Well, the uncertainty associated with wind is we could have calm weeks where there's absolutely no wind, and I'm wondering how challenging that is to wind development and to pricing, and what it might cost a consumer who wants, for instance, to change to purchasing all of their electric power from a wind source.
Well, that's all bundled together it's not like if there's no wind, it's not like you don't get any electricity, essentially. So certainly, usually you're buying a blend of some sort, or I don't know if you can speak to that any better than I can. But
Not very well, but a mix of sources of energy
Yeah,
is the most
yeah.
responsible strategy.
Well, I think people are curious, and I'm going to take, that was Sean's call we had just a second ago. I'm going to go to Fred from Somerset in just a second. Okay. So why do we sometimes pass wind farms and a couple of the turbines are rotating and some of them are idled?
So usually there's at least maybe two maintenance workers on a wind farm for the typical sizes that we see of them around here. And so there's usually somebody in at least one of them, and they'll be shut down while somebody is in there.
And when you say in there, there's actually an
somebody-
elevator or stairs to take you, a ladder of some sort that takes you 400 feet up.
Yeah, so at least one of them might be shut down for that. If they are sometimes shut down if they have rotated in the same direction too many times, they will shut down and they will uncoil themselves and go back. Sometimes, they are just down waiting for maintenance for one reason or another. And sometimes if they're all not moving, there's just not enough wind to get them, they're below the cut-in wind speed of the whole farm.
Okay.
Or a couple turbines might not be seeing the same wind as the rest of the wind farm, like a whole cluster of them aren't moving.
And revolutions per minute, what are we talking? I mean, how fast are these blades spinning on a really windy day?
Oh, probably no more than 18 revolutions per minute. It's not, that rotational speed is not very quick. I mean, the tip speed gets up there because they're so long, maybe 70, I don't want to say meters per second, something like that. That's limited. Again, you don't want that to get too fast, or that becomes more of a sound issue. But
Okay, which we may talk about. Sean from State College, you're on the air.
Hi, ladies. Good evening. I had a question for homeowners who have their own windmill on their property. I know there's a man up the road who has one, and they're probably, 3 feet long blades? And what I was basically wondering was the combination of a solar panels on your roof, plus the windmill, your own personal windmill. What impact would that have on your energy costs and production usage for an individual household, whether or not either of you have studied that?
So, do you want to comment?
I haven't studied
Okay.
that. When we
So-
looked at industrial scale.
Okay. So, well, right now, it depends on how windy your land is on the wind side of it, for sure. Solar is definitely pretty good everywhere as long as you stay out of the shade. And the cost of solar has come down significantly, and the efficiency is not too bad. So actually, the efficiency in terms of solar and wind might be relatively on the same playing field, essentially. So solar is a pretty good bet actually right now for residential scale, I would say. Wind is very different in terms of it can be really good and it can be really bad economically, just purely depending on how windy your site is. And unfortunately in Pennsylvania, unless you're on top of the ridges like where we have our industrial scale wind farms, it's not as likely that you have enough wind to make it economically viable to have for me to just say flat out, oh yeah, go for it.
But what would a wind turbine for home use cost, generally speaking?
Something that could support your home. It might be, and let me just say this, so there's something called the Small Wind Certification Council. You can look them up online. So there's a process for certifying small wind turbines now, and I would recommend using one of those wind turbines that's been certified, because it's kind of the Wild West for these small turbines. There's ones that are vertical axis turbines that look, everybody loves the look of them. Architects absolutely adore them, but none of those are on the Small Wind Certification Council list yet.
Which means they may or may not work as advertised.
Exactly. So I recommend the products that are on the Small Wind Certification Council's list. So you want to make sure you have a certified installer. And basically, there's the cost of the turbine, and then there's the cost to install them. You have to have a pretty sturdy foundation, and it's probably about double the cost from what you see the price tag for the turbine, and then what it's going to cost to install them. So the turbine itself might be $10,000. It might cost another $10,000 to install it. You might be able to save cost on the installation if you know somebody with a crane or other equipment or concrete or things like that. That's where sometimes you can save some money. I run the Pennsylvania Wind for Schools program, so we put some small turbines at schools around the state. We have 2 on campus, so I have some experience with this. But generally, they're not going to produce as much power as they might if you were in Montana or South Dakota or
there's one at the middle school for those who live in State College.
Yep.
So
Mount Nittany Middle School has one. Mm-hmm.
And what is it generating per year? What percentage is it cutting maybe from the electric bill?
Well, the one we have on campus and the one at Mount Nittany Middle School, I would say, are probably doing about the same. They're probably producing about 800 kilowatt hours a year.
Which translates into?
Which is about how much you would use in a month in a home. So ideally, it would be producing that in a month. That scale of turbine might not be expected to produce quite that much in a month, but for that size. But it's just not quite windy enough to support that much.
Okay, we go to Fred, who is calling us from Somerset. Somerset, of course, is the county where the state's very first turbines went in. What can you tell us about that, Fred?
Well, I am so confused. I listened to your program, and I watched the turbines turning, and I was originally calling to find out dollar for dollar the difference between the actual value of the electricity being produced by these 3 different methods. That would be natural gas, I guess, coal, and the turbines. But after listening to the program, I am totally confused. I don't quite understand what they're saying here. Without the subsidies, is the wind? I'm for wind turbines too. I think that's a great idea, but
you're not sure if it's
really
worth
paying
it
for itself.
Okay. So can you answer that? I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is that it fluctuates and all these different variables come into play, whether it's cost efficient to produce electricity using wind turbine, or how can you answer his question?
Okay, so when a wind project is conceived, you have a certain wind resource. You project out how much energy that site will generate. You then figure out how much it will cost to develop that project, and you essentially finance it, just like you would a home. I mean, you can equate this essentially to something like a mortgage, and what your payments would be, and then calculate how much energy you would produce, and you can come up with what is a cost per kilowatt hour, which we call that levelized cost of energy. And you can compare that levelized cost of energy with what your competitive levelized cost of energy is from the other sources in your local area, from coal and from natural gas. If that levelized cost of energy is less than those other numbers, and then of course if you have that production tax credit, you can deduct it from that levelized cost of energy and count that in, and that helps. If you don't have the production tax credit, then you're just comparing it flat out directly with those other numbers. So basically a project is not built if it's not less than its competitors or competitive with that. So
how, I guess to answer in a simple way, how competitive is wind energy today?
It's very competitive. I mean, or these projects wouldn't be being built.
Okay.
And certainly there's a huge level of uncertainty analysis that is done, because you have to go to the bank and you have to borrow money. I mean, these companies borrow money to build these projects, and the wind isn't the same every year. So they have to take data for several years to prove to the bank that they're pretty sure that it's going to produce the amount of energy that they say that it's going to produce. And certainly one year is not going to be as good as another year, but honestly, once the project is built, the energy is free, so you want to put as much of that into the grid as you possibly can.
Because there are very few inputs. There's regular maintenance, of course.
Right.
But beyond that,
there's no fuel cost. So, I mean, what's really interesting, on these very cold days where it's very windy, the way the electricity market works is the most expensive power plant that is put onto the grid dictates the cost of electricity for everybody. And so on these extremely cold days where we've got everybody turning on electric heat all over the north part of the country, the electricity costs go through the roof. You may not see it on residential customers, but the industrial customers start having to pay like $1.50 per kilowatt hour all of a sudden, when we're used to seeing 6 cents. $1.50 per kilowatt hour because oil power plants have to be turned on to meet this demand. What's happening is, as the wind supply increases, they don't have to turn on those extremely expensive power plants, and it's saving a ton of money to all of the consumers across the board. A study just came out that showed last year during the polar vortex, $1 billion was saved because of wind.
Interesting.
Because when it's extremely cold, it's extremely windy. And just in January, earlier in January, when we had a very cold snap and it was very windy, they haven't come up with an actual statistic of the number, but that there was another, they predict a big savings. And they boiled it down to about $15 per person or per consumer, probably was the savings.
I'm going to go to an email, and then I have a question for Tamara. This email from Janice, she writes, how do wind turbines connect to the electric grid? No wires are visible from the road. Interesting question, Janice.
Go underground.
Okay, so two transmission lines that are underground, the same as they are underground if you're
neighborhoods.
Well, if you're moving natural gas, this is also underground. Why, because this is sort of a follow-up to her question, why do some turbines have 2 blades and others have 3? And is this just a design change, or is there some reason that 2 blades make sense in one area and 3 in another?
Most often you're going to see 3. It's more of an aesthetically pleasing design. I don't know how many people have seen 2, but we do have a 2-bladed turbine on campus. They're both aerodynamically good designs. The 2-bladed is a little, they both have pluses and minuses to them. I would say the 3 might be more, I think, pleasing to the eye, is why I would say it wins more often. But also the 2 blades, when you've got one at the top and one at the bottom, there's a little bit of instability just with the wind hitting it. So the 3 balances out a little bit better.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, Tamara, because getting back to this energy impacts assessment that the Nature Conservancy did, you were looking at those 3 relatively new energy sources that I mentioned earlier, fracking, wind energy, and wood biomass. And I'm wondering what impact they have on priority conservation habitats across Pennsylvania, and what are Pennsylvania's priority conservation habitats?
That's a great question. Our study actually focused on forested habitats mostly. That was our focus, and we looked at those 3 energy sources because they could have impacts on forested habitats and species that depend on large blocks of forest. Pennsylvania at the turn of the last century was heavily deforested from the logging industry and the coal mining industry, and since then has recovered fairly well, and now we're a stronghold for large intact forest habitats on which a lot of species depend, like salamanders and songbirds and even birds of prey like the northern goshawk that need large expanses. So we were concerned about how these new forms of energy development could reduce that forested habitat and fragment it and cut it into little pieces and make it less usable for those species that need large forest chunks, essentially. So forest habitat in general, large forested habitats are of particular concern in this region. And then there are, of course, rare habitats where rare species live, things like shrublands, or it's an unfortunate name, but we call them barrens, or cliffs or rocky outcrops, things that have species that are pretty specialized and need those habitats, and things like the Allegheny wood rat or the timber rattlesnake. So a whole suite of things. And we looked at how the footprint of the development of Marcellus and wind, Marcellus gas development and wind development, could impact those species and the habitats in general. And looked at that cumulatively.
Well, when you look at forest fragmentation, which is the bigger concern, and maybe that isn't even a fair question, but when you look at wind or you look at Marcellus development, what are you more concerned about?
All of it, really. It all needs to be considered, and all of it, proper siting and locating this development in areas that are most suitable for that, and that where the harm to the environment will be the least. But we did find that in terms of the infrastructure that was the most impactful, negatively impactful, it was really the linear infrastructure. So the access roads to the wind turbines and to the Marcellus gas pads, and the pipelines and the electric transmission lines, those are really what
cause the forest fragmentation, right? I mean, you can see it if you're looking from a plane down. You really see where these transmission lines are, and
so that causes the effects to be much more widespread than just the direct clearing at the site of the turbine.
Could narrowing a road help reduce that forest fragmentation?
Yes, absolutely. And well, first of all, using existing roads in existing cleared areas, right? So you're not removing natural habitat to create the infrastructure. But yes, having narrow roads that are as narrow as possible, and transmission corridors that are as narrow as possible, so that it allows for passage of species. If you think of a little salamander that's trying to cross a really dry road with no canopy cover, with no trees overhead, it's really going to be hard for that little salamander to cross the road, for example.
I think what they typically do is they'll clear it as wide as they need to get the cranes to get through. And then once they're done constructing, they'll at least revegetate
around the road
of it, just so that they have enough road access
for a normal-sized truck to get up and down.
Right.
We have another email from a viewer. Let's go to that. This is from Kathy. She says, "Can the Nature Conservancy individuals speak about anything that is being done to turbines to minimize bird fatalities?" And I think we'll ask both of you about that. But this is something we hear a lot about. What role do wind turbines play in bird fatalities, Tamara?
Great question. So my understanding is early on in the wind industry, the turbine design was much different, and it was a lattice structure that it just invited birds to sit and perch on the wind turbines, believe it or not. We've come a long way from that now, and so there are no places to perch, so that helps. But in terms of bird fatalities, the Pennsylvania Game Commission studies that I mentioned earlier have found that approximately 4 birds per turbine per year are killed. And that's in comparison to about 25 bats per turbine per year. So the effects on birds is much lower than on bats. And of the birds killed, most of them are songbirds. They're migratory songbirds that spend the summers here and the winter in warmer climates. There are, raptors or birds of prey like hawks and eagles that are impacted, but less than songbirds. And they tend to be impacted, or there are large mortality events when under certain weather conditions, when the cloud cover is low, or when there is cloud cover and the birds can't see the stars to navigate, because most of the birds migrate at night, and so they can get confused with lights on at night. And so a way to mitigate that and to reduce bird mortality is actually on the operational side to use proper lighting. So of course lighting is required on industrial scale wind turbines on top of the
a red light.
Right, for aviation safety, of course. But some research has shown that white strobing lights is less attractive to birds than red continuous lights. And the same with lighting on the ground at the surface. For worker safety, of course, you need lighting at the pad site. But there are ways to reduce that as well by putting in sensors to make sure that the area is lit only when there's actually someone there, and also making sure that the lights are turned downward and not skyward to attract the birds. So there are things that can be done to try to reduce how attractive a wind site is to birds.
So you said 25 birds per year per turbine, and we have how many?
25 bats per year.
Bats per year, and four birds per year per turbine.
That's right.
Times the number of turbines in Pennsylvania,
That's
which
right.
I think 720.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking 10,000 or more bird kills per year. Now, the U.S. Committee North American Bird conservation initiative says that the number one killer of birds is power lines. The number two is automobiles. The number three, and we're talking about in the millions, windows in buildings. But the number one threat to birds in this country, 2.4 billion birds killed each year by cats. That said, I'm still wondering what we can do with wind turbines to make them safer places. You mentioned some of it, the lights, but is there a design change?
Quite honestly, I mean, the bat issue is, I think, a much more significant issue than the bird issue. Like you mentioned, the early wind farm raised the concern about birds, and it is not nearly the same problem that it was in the very first wind farms out in California that were sited improperly in a migratory bird route, and that's just not the practice anymore. They're very careful about siting of wind farms to stay away from migratory bird routes. And that's the biggest change.
In some ways, though, it's difficult to do that in Pennsylvania because
well, if you don't know where the migratory bird routes
and
are,
a lot more research is needed, especially on bat, migration.
Yes. So, but that's part of it, and the technology change. I mean, because they were much faster spinning turbines. They had the lattice towers, which did attract them to come and roost. So, I mean, there are a couple of different factors which caused some very significant issues early on. But the bats. And then the bats also have a operational impact that can help, where they found most of the mortality is happening for that during migration, the fall migration, during the just above the cut-in wind speed of the turbines. And then a lot of there have been some studies that found that if they increase the cut-in wind speed, so they start operating the turbines at a slightly higher wind speed, so of course the owners are making a little bit less money, but they can decrease the bat mortality significantly. I mean, I think it's something on the order of 60 to 80% less bat deaths.
And of course, bats are enormously important to Pennsylvania agriculture, what they mean in terms of eating insects and what that means in terms of what we're not putting on crops in terms of insecticides. Pesticides, it's just absolutely enormous. And on top of the wind turbine, you've got the snowy white, I can't think of the syndrome.
The white nose syndrome. That's in the cave-dwelling bats, right? Yeah. So this is the tree-dwelling bats are being impacted by the wind turbines. The cave-dwelling bats are being impacted by the white nose syndrome, right?
Two big groups of bats in Pennsylvania, tree-dwelling bats that migrate, that don't spend the winters here, and then cave-dwelling bats that hibernate here for the winter in caves. And the cave-dwelling bats are the ones that have been really hit hard, as much as 95% reduction in their population by white nose syndrome. The migratory bats, so the tree-dwelling bats, are disproportionately experience higher fatality rates from wind turbines. But as Dr. Stewart said, just increasing that minimum speed when the turbine's blades are allowed to spin and produce energy can really reduce bat fatalities by a lot, especially if that curtailment is what it's called, especially if that occurs in the fall. Late July to early October is when most of the bat fatalities occur.
Well, the bat fatalities are interesting for a number of reasons. One, unlike the birds, where I've actually watched videos online where you see the turbine, you see the blade spin, and you see a bird get caught in it, hit, and fall to the ground. It sounds like the bats, from what I've watched online and read, we're finding them and there's no blunt trauma to them, and there's speculation that something's happening to their lungs as a result of the pressure from the blades.
Yeah, I don't know if you know any more about this than I do. I mean, I know that there's still some, this is still under study, but there's speculation as to whether it's barotrauma, whether their lungs are exploding from the pressure differential, like the bends, like if you're scuba diving and you come up too fast. But there's also been studies questioning whether that's enough of a pressure differential for that to actually happen, and that they might actually being
hit, but we're not. But they're not seeing it on an examination.
Yeah. So I think they're still trying to figure out exactly what's happening.
A lot more research is needed. That's why studies initiated as part of this voluntary cooperative agreement that the Pennsylvania Game Commission is doing are so important to to understand where migratory routes are for birds and bats, and also to know where cave entrances are and hibernacula are for bats, and where they forage and where they need. It's hard to avoid those areas if you don't know where they are, right?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Let's sort of wrap this up. I'm just wondering what your concerns are going forward, because our demand for energy isn't diminishing, and it's going to come from somewhere, and there isn't an energy source that doesn't have some impact. So, Tamara, what are your final thoughts or advice or predictions about the future?
Well, we'd love to see a responsible energy strategy that includes energy efficiency measures. That's really the cleanest and greenest form of energy. Is you know, a kilowatt not used is really the cleanest and greenest form of energy. So energy efficiency measures to reduce the overall amount of energy that we're using and consuming, and then reducing emissions from fossil fuels and increasing their efficiency, and then of course, encouraging deployment of a mix of renewable energy sources, including wind, but of course, making sure that those sources of energy are properly sited. They're located in places where the potential harm to the environment is really avoided or minimized.
Dr. Stewart.
So I guess I'd like to encourage people who are, advocates of renewable energy to be mindful of those who aren't, and consider that there are all sorts of opinions on the topic, and that I'd like to encourage people who are not advocates of wind energy to consider what are the alternatives. If you don't have a wind turbine in your backyard, what are you going to have there? Would you like a coal power plant there? Would you like nuclear power? And think about that as well. Always just think balanced, and that's what I always encourage my students to think about.
And are there lots of students involved in wind power, studying wind power?
Oh yeah, I have 60 in my undergraduate class now, and we have, I think, 15 or 20 studying at a graduate level.
Okay, and on that note, we are out of time. Thank you both so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
Our guests have been Susan Stewart, faculty member in the Department of Engineering at Penn State, and Tamara Gagnolet, a scientist at the Nature Conservancy's Pennsylvania office. Thank you all for watching and listening. I'm Patty Satalia. For all of us here at WPSU, have a good night.